Hello, everyone. It's good to have you with us again for another life story coming to you from Life Stories Worldwide. It's live on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. Please tell your friends, please share it with them that they could watch this wonderful story this evening. Tonight, we have a guest speaker from East London. But let me tell you, first of all, if you need help, need prayer, then contact us on our hotline, +44 794 355 0287. Or you can go to our website, lifestoriesworldwide.com. And again, you'll find lots of information to help you, to encourage you. You can even download an app from there onto your phone. Tonight, we welcome especially those in Ukraine who are joining us, and the people in Torch Trust who are listening to us as well. But we welcome you all tonight to this story where Bobbi Kumari, who is a teacher, an author, she formed her own fashion outlet, but she's really passionate about evangelism. She shares the gospel wherever she can, in the most strange places, which she'll probably tell you about, unusual places, but she has a passion to reach the lost with the good news of the gospel. So I'm going to hand over to Bobbi now to tell her story. Thank you, Bobbi.
Thank you so much, Alan, and it's such a joy to join you all tonight and to be able to share my story, my testimony. So I was actually born in East London. My parents are both from India, and so they came over to this country in the 70s. And so when I was born, although I was born in the West, because of my family's Indian culture, it meant that I, was torn between two cultures when it came to my upbringing. And my parents, they obviously loved us so much, and their way of showing us how much they loved us, as with many traditional Indian families, is the parents provide for their children, the parents serve their children, like that's their love language. And so even though my parents were really loving when it came to looking after us and working and providing for us, but actually my parents weren't very affectionate, certainly not my dad. And he used to have an alcohol problem, and he would gamble. And although he would sometimes get drunk and be like super loving and affectionate towards us, but then he could also at the same time get drunk and be very violent, super violent towards my mum, super violent at times towards my brothers. And so we kind of grew up walking on eggshells, really. And my dad was also quite aloof and distant. So although he was at home every night, he would sometimes be drunk and he would sometimes be emotionally distant. And so what that meant for me personally was just that I never really heard him, affirm me or speak words of love or validation over me. And in fact, when I was born, my dad really wanted me to be a boy. And so when he found out I was a girl, the day I was born, he didn't come to the hospital. He literally did not come to the hospital for the first 3 days because I wasn't a boy. And so I definitely think I grew up with a sense of rejection because of that early rejection that I kind of was on the receiving end of when I was born. And as I was growing up, my parents, they brought us up with love, but they were also super traditional and had like loads of, just morals and conditions that we had to live with. And so as Asians, the girls weren't allowed to have boyfriends. We obviously weren't allowed to smoke or drink. We had to be home by a certain time. So very, very conventional, traditional, cultural upbringing for us. But I was quite wild. And so that was quite pressurizing for me to have that kind of an environment growing up. But I definitely loved my parents so much, and I wanted to honor them, and I wanted to, respect them and obey them. But I often found that quite hard to do. And we were also raised with a Hindu religion, because that's where my parents in India, that's the faith that they have. And so growing up, we would have a lot of prayer meetings. Voodoo was quite normal in my culture. I would watch at these prayer meetings in my house or other family homes. I would watch people get possessed, by demonic entities that, while Hindus are worshipping, obviously they believe that these are gods that they're worshipping. And my parents believed that these were gods that they were worshipping. And I would watch, people get possessed and their eyes would begin to gyrate and their head would begin to spin. And although it was quite normal for me, but there was always a sense of like, I couldn't necessarily connect with what I was seeing in front of me. And so these were like the dynamics with which I were growing up. And at the same time, in my upbringing, with this traditional influence and with this religious influence of Hinduism, I was also molested as a child. And so in my family, or in my culture, I would say it's quite common for there to be molestation, and no one really talks about it. No one gets pulled up about it. It is what just happens. And so I grew up with those kinds of different dysfunctions that were going on around my head. But for me, it just seemed quite normal. It seemed normal to have violence in the house. It seemed normal to be in prayer meetings where you'd see a lot of the occult. It was no one really made a big deal about being molested. And I remember going to India when I was 11 years old. And I remember having, wasn't necessarily a spiritual encounter, but I believe that this is probably the first time I sensed God speaking to my heart. And I remember being in India and reading these comics to do with Hinduism. And for me personally, I found it super difficult to relate to Hinduism because there was a lot of pain in my family. Like I'd seen my mum be violently abused by my dad at times. I'd seen her try to commit suicide. I'd see her crying quite a lot. And she was a devout Hindu. She used to have a shrine in the house. And so she was worshipping all these gods. And I would always be confused as to why these gods could not hear her prayers. And I remember being in India and I remember reading these Indian comics.
Life Stories.
all the deities and all the gods, and reading the stories and the legends of the Hindu gods. And as I was reading all the stories, I remember like my head being so confused, because I just kept thinking, like, how did all these, demigods, how did all these half monkeys and half humans, how did they create the earth? And then once they created the earth, how are they now just statues? And now that they're just statues, how are they expected to answer our prayers? And so I remember lying on the bed, like being so confused about this. I felt as if my head was physically going to explode with the confusion. And I remember coming back to London, still questioning, those things. And once I got back to London, about 6 months after the trip, someone knocked at my front door, and it was a woman called Caroline from a local church. And she began to tell us about the local church and about this club. And as we started going to the club, she began to tell us about Christianity. And she began to tell us about Jesus and about God. And as she began to talk about this living savior, immediately I was like, I want to know this God, because this God is alive. And the God that my parents have introduced me to, that God is dead, and it's statues and clay and stone, but this God is alive. And so I became a Christian at the age of 12, and I would go to church and I would read scriptures, and I'd read the Bible, the Gospels throughout the whole night. And I was so drawn to this Christian God, but somehow there was a disconnect, because I did not realize what God had done for me. I did not realize that this living savior had actually, been crucified and then died and rose again. I had no real understanding as to how this living savior was alive. I just knew that this God is alive, and now I'm going to follow this God. And so I had no real revelation of his grace, had no real revelation of what I'd been delivered from. I had no real revelation that he loved me unconditionally, and that I wasn't saved by anything I could do. It wasn't how much I fasted, it wasn't how much I prayed, it wasn't how good I was, it was simply his grace. I didn't understand any of that. And so I ended up being quite religious as a 12-year-old. I ended up praying religiously every night, ended up reading scriptures and going to church religiously. However, at the same time, because of the molestation that I'd experienced as a child, and because of all those influences of the occult, and because of my dad's violent behavior and his alcohol addictions, at the same time as me being a Christian at the age of 12, I was smoking, I was drinking, I was reading adult books, I was sneaking out of my bedroom window. And so I lived this double life. And I think a huge part of that was down to the fact that my parents were quite strict, and I had this huge pressure to really want to please them and not to disappoint them. And so I grew up like performing. I grew up keeping all the rules. I grew up, doing one thing to gain my parents' approval, but behind the scenes, continuously living a double life. And because of the different molestation that had happened, I had really just developed quite a pornographic mind, or certainly my sexual innocence had been stolen. And I remember at the age of around 13, so I'm a Christian now as a child, but I'm reading adult books and I'm, doing all these sinful things. And I remember having a dream, and in this dream I had it was a sexual dream, and I think I was only about 13 years at the time. And I remember waking up the following morning recognizing that I'd had a sexual dream, and I recognized that I'd had, even though I didn't know what an orgasm was at the time, but I remember waking up and feeling like this sense of I'd experienced something that felt really, really good. And so that dream stayed with me. And then I remember a couple of days after that, a couple of weeks after that, I found myself literally lying on the bed and beginning to touch myself. And I found myself just masturbating and having an orgasm, and then connecting immediately that, wow, this is the sensation that I felt in my dream. And so after that, as a Christian, as a 13-year-old, as someone who was going to church, in front of my mum, I was like a really good Indian girl. I was trying to do the right thing. But now, as a 13-year-old, I was drinking, smoking, masturbating, reading adult books, had a pornographic mind. That was the kind of dysfunction I was now walking in. And as all of this is going on, even though I am a Christian, I am getting worse and worse in the things that I am involving myself in. And so I'm watching horror movies. I'm now bunking school. I'm getting more and more pornographic in the way that I am thinking. But as an Indian girl, because I wasn't allowed to have any boyfriends, I always knew at that stage in my life that I couldn't have a boyfriend. And the reason I knew that is because every single time my sister would be involved with a boy, as soon as my dad would find out, he would then, as a result, beat my mum. Because in the Indian culture, when the children do something wrong, oftentimes it's the mum that's blamed. And so I used to watch my dad, beat my mum because of something my sister had done relating to a boy. So even at that time, even though my mind was quite pornographic, even though I flirted a lot, even though I would hang around with a lot of boys, but I had like this unpardonable sin that I could never commit, which was I could never have a boyfriend. And so what that did is it ended up creating a sense of self-righteousness in me, where I would look down at all the girls in my school that I knew were sexually active, and I'd think that I was so righteous, even though I was doing all of these sinful things. But I think I was so righteous because, all the boys that were maybe approaching me, I would always say, no, no, no. And I would have this false sense of righteousness because of that. And my biggest desire, really, even with my wild personality, was protecting my mum. But around the age of 15, someone introduced me to R&B music. And the music, I had never really heard R&B music before. And as I began to listen to this music, the lyrics, the spirit behind the music, like the kind of vibe of these songs, it literally began to impact me so powerfully. That any moral boundaries that I did have at that time, they began to disintegrate. And I found myself wanting to do the things that I was watching in the music videos. I found myself like having seeds planted in my mind about promiscuity, about, fornication, about two-timing, because these were the things that were being promoted in these music videos. And I remember by this time, I had literally just turned 16. And I was super excited because I'd just been accepted at the London College of Fashion. I wanted to be a fashion designer. So I was so prepared, ready for this dream of being a designer. But the summer before I was starting college, that's when I really got into the R&B music. And I found myself then sneaking out of my bedroom window 5 nights a week to go clubbing as a 16-year-old, listening to R&B music all the time. And now, as I started my place at the London College of Fashion, I was completely different to the girl I had been 2.5 months ago when I had just finished school. Now, as I started, my place in this college in central London, all I wanted to do was fun. All I wanted to do was have fun. I didn't even really care about protecting my mum anymore. I didn't care about not having boyfriends anymore. I literally just was driven by the pursuit of fun. And I believe a huge factor of that was, in fact, the music that I had begun listening to. And so as I started this fashion course, within literally weeks, I had my first boyfriend, became sexually active very, very quickly. I decided that I didn't want to be a Christian anymore because I knew that I couldn't cope with the guilt and the conviction that I felt when I became sexually active. So I decided to leave Christianity, and I just embarked on a life of fun. And as a result of that, I completely failed my fashion course. But because education really is the only way in my family that I could really even get freedom, I continued to lie to my parents, even though by the time I got to the end of the course, I had failed it, but I couldn't tell my mum that. I didn't want to disappoint her, and I wanted to leave home. And the only way really I could leave home is through the education route. And so I lied to my mum. I told her that I'd, passed my course, and now I was going to the next course up. And so I needed to leave home because the place I was studying was quite far away, and my parents believed me. And so I left home and I started my new course. But really, I was on unemployment benefit. All I was doing was clubbing and meeting my boyfriend at the time. And I ended up falling pregnant. And so once I fell pregnant, I felt that the only choice I really had was to have an abortion, because my mum didn't know I was, I had a boyfriend. There's no way I could bring that shame on my mum or my family. And so I decided to have a termination. And then I moved back home after that termination, just feeling quite depressed and feeling quite down. And I remember my mum showing me so much mercy, even though she had no idea what was going on, but she showed me so much mercy. She looked after me. She loved on me. She never once questioned why I was crying or why I was so sad. And I really felt that that was the mercy of God reaching out to me. And even though I had left Jesus, even though I was no longer a Christian, I felt that he really had been gracious to me, because despite me failing my course, I managed to get onto another fashion course that would help me get onto a degree. And I really decided that I'm gonna not mess up my life anymore. I'm gonna focus on my studies. And so I got onto this next course, and I was doing brilliantly. I was enjoying the course so much. I was excited about life. And I got towards the end of this fashion course, and I got a place on a fashion degree. So excited. And then before the end of that fashion course, again, before the summer began, when I was going to start my fashion degree, I bumped into an old friend. And this particular girl, she was into Class A drugs. She was into house music. She was quite promiscuous. And immediately, as soon as I started hanging out with her, that was it. I got straight into Class A drugs. I started smoking weed every day. I started getting into house music. And before I knew it, even though I started my fashion degree, again, I didn't really care about studying anymore. And by now I had a different boyfriend, and I moved in with him. And I literally spent the next 5 years just, for the first 3 years, I was on this degree, but I was high every day, drinking, smoking, didn't really care about studying. But again, that was the only way I could stay out of the house and not have to go back and have an arranged marriage. And so I just lived a very hedonistic lifestyle, barely making it through my degree. And I, again, during my degree, got pregnant for the second time. And once again, I found myself having an abortion again. And I was finding myself getting more and more of a void inside of me, and the drugs and the alcohol and, my relationship with my boyfriend, that just really could not satisfy me. And I remember towards the end of my degree, my dad died. He suddenly died. And again, my way of coping with that was the alcohol, the drugs, dancing hard in clubs. And within me, the void would just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I remember after my dad died, deciding that actually I'm not happy. I'm going to leave my boyfriend, and I'm going to find someone else, and hopefully that will make me happy. And as I did that, as I broke things off with my boyfriend, who actually at that time had become my fiance, I started looking for love in other places. And I found that I just couldn't find love. I found no matter how many drugs I took, no matter, where I went, whether I went to strip clubs, whether I went to nightclubs, whether I went, whether I got the guy that I wanted, nothing seemed to fill the void. And I ended up, as a result of that, filled with so much guilt and shame for leaving my boyfriend, filled with so much self-hatred. I still was masturbating. I still was so enslaved to so many different things that I found that the guilt and the shame and the condemnation, like really just hating myself for who I'd become, it would eat away at me. And so the only way I knew how to cope was to take more drugs and to sleep around. And so I would just sleep around recklessly. I would sleep around. And I found myself like feeling lonely. I found myself being getting so deeply embedded in darkness and pain. But what had happened while all this is going on, and even though I didn't know God anymore, but the same woman who had led me to God when I was a 12-year-old, even though I was no longer a Christian, but she had led my mum to the Lord. And so as I'm like going through this destructive phase in my life where I don't want to know God anymore, I'm hitting rock bottom, my mum had begun to pray for me. And one day she said to me, "Bobbi, I'm having a prayer meeting. Will you come to my house?" And so I said, "Fine, Mum, I'll come to the house."
Life Stories.